There are roughly 6 million commercial buildings in the United States. The vast majority have no real-time data coming off their HVAC equipment. No alerts, no diagnostics, no visibility until something breaks and a tenant complains. And when something does break, there's a process. The store calls the facility manager calls the service provider dispatches a technician that then shows up, figures out what's wrong, and orders the parts and maybe comes back later. In the meantime, the store is hot or cold or down entirely. That chain from problem to resolution is slow, expensive, and almost entirely dependent on people talking to each other on the phone. And on top of that, the technicians who fix the equipment are harder to find and more expensive than they've ever been. So how do we fix this? I'm Edward Cohen, and this is Tangent, a Commercial Observer podcast. I'm joined today by Zach Ahrens, also known as What If Messi Could Use Claude? Hi, Zach. How are you?
I'm doing great.
I'm excited to say we do have the perfect guest to talk about this, Clayton Callander, founder and president of Field Technologies. Hi, Clayton. Where does this podcast find you?
Hey, Edward. Thanks for having me on. I am based in San Francisco, here down in Soma, right next to the Giants Stadium.
Nice. Before we get into the company, Clayton, give us a background. I mean, you've worked on nuclear submarines, SpaceX, running an HVAC company. How does someone end up founding a building technology startup from all of that?
You always have to find something that makes you excited to get up in the morning and go in and solve interesting problems. And for me, I think the crisis of my life and every job I've been in before this one has been trying to find something that will balance the engineering side of my brain with like the business and strategy side of my brain. And from the Navy to SpaceX to then, like working for a hedge fund, I've always kind of been tilted too much to one side or too much to the other side. And having the opportunity to found a startup that we have our hands in a little bit of hardware, lots of software and engineering and data science, a little bit of machine learning, and then also the fundraising, business management aspects of it. Being able to do all of that just means that whenever I get bored of one thing, I have 10 other things in entirely different categories to pivot to and use other parts of my brain. So that makes it really fun and make sure that I never have a second of boredom, which is great.
Yeah, sounds like a pretty entertaining mix. So walk us through what actually happens when an HVAC unit goes down, say, in a retail store or restaurant. Who calls who? Where does the time go?
Well, I think at the beginning of the podcast, you gave an excellent summary and one that describes a process that I don't think has changed since the dawn of facilities management. The only thing I would add to your flow is a lot of the communication and data gets lost because you're essentially playing a game telephone. Something breaks in the store, maybe there's a leak or the store is too hot. The store manager or some other store employee is calling a facilities management firm, or if they have internal facilities management, their own facility manager at some corporate office. But they're not a technical expert. So their explanation of the problem is, I have a leak in the break room or the store is too hot. And that facility manager has probably 10 other problems they have to follow up on. They reach out to a technician that they haven't really talked to in a while because, these stores only have issues maybe once a quarter, and they're trying to seem valuable enough that that technician's going to respond. So they'll say something along the lines of like, hey, the store is hot. They'll use a very blunt force object called the not to exceed, or NTE. So a facilities management firm will say, any HVAC problem, we're going to dispatch with a $750 not to exceed. But these days, with these technician rates, by the time the technician drives for an hour to get there, spends an hour on site trying to gain access because, maybe the store is in a mall and you have to go to the security office and get permission to go on the rooftop, and then finds the actual asset because store is hot tells me nothing about which of the 10 RTUs on the roof is actually having the problem. And then goes and finally cracks the unit open and starts diagnosing. They've probably burned through $500 of that $750 not to exceed. And as soon as you hit that, most facilities management firms will not authorize additional work without having a quote. So then you're going to have to go back to the home office or call your service manager, get a quote written up, send it to the facilities management firm. They're going to have to get approval. So you pretty much, with the current process, all this said and done, unless it's the simplest of problems, you're pretty much guaranteed that every problem takes at least 2 truck rolls, which is kind of like a lose-lose proposition for everybody. The facilities management firm is paying for 2 times the drive time, all that time it takes to get on the roof, get on site, pull up tools. An extra truck will doubles the inefficiency of all of that. And the service provider doesn't want to do that either. The most profitable work for them is work where they are slinging parts, productive work, not just diagnostic work. So they would prefer if, they could move that lever from like 50% diagnostics down to like 40% or 30% or even 25%. That means their profit margins are better too. All this being said, there's like a true win-win to be found in the market, I think, where both sides of the equation want to limit the amount of time they spend on diagnostics and maximize the amount of time they spend on actually like repairing and fixing problems.
Zach, as Clayton pointed out, the way we've been addressing HVAC issues in commercial buildings hasn't changed dramatically in decades. How do you think about this problem? Is it frequent enough? Is it painful enough? Do we have now the right technologies to address it in a more proactive or better way?
I've been chasing the dream of preventative HVAC maintenance for almost 20 years now. And we've had sort of fits and starts with it. It's definitely the single most painful pain point that any property manager goes through. When I was a property manager, the vast majority of the angry phone calls I would get would be about some sort of broken HVAC. Sometimes that can lead to even worse problems, right? Not just the comfort of let's say it's a retail store, not just the comfort of the shoppers, but in some cases it can lead to flooding, damages, electrical fires, all types of things. And there's really no reason, based on the advancements in sensor technology and hardware, that we can't have preventative maintenance, but we have yet to achieve it. So I'm super, super excited that we're finally pushing towards this, what was once an elusive goal.
Yeah, Zach, you bring up a really good point in that the technology has been around for a long time. And a lot of what I would call your like class A real estate has the instrumentation already installed through one of the like major controls players, like your Johnson Controls or your ABB, to solve this problem, right? So the way I always like to put it is it's not a technology problem. It's like an access to this technology problem, because the service providers, if only 5%, let's say, of the buildings they serve are these like skyscrapers or these government facilities or these like oil and gas manufacturing plants that have these like sophisticated control solutions and are instrumented enough for predictive maintenance, they're not going to invest in getting access to that data because it's only like 1% of their portfolio that they serve. So I think the problem is not like, how do we solve the problem from a technology perspective? It's how do we make this technology accessible enough, both from a price standpoint and an access standpoint, right? Like not locking data in servers and making the instrumentation affordable enough that like not just your skyscraper can afford it, your strip mall building can afford it. And only then will it be ubiquitous enough that like connecting service providers to it and facility management firms to it will make sense.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the proliferation of these very advanced building management systems, whether they're Honeywell or Johnson Controls or Schneider, they're really only in these very, very fancy buildings. And they're really only when the landlords are running gross or modified gross leases. In a retail or an industrial context, it can be a little squishier. It doesn't make sense financially for the landlord to install one of them. They're usually running triple net leases, but in many cases, they're still responsible for the base building HVAC systems. And so the question is, which is what seems like you're addressing, is how do we get this type of technology, insights, and data into the hands of the 99% of buildings that exist that are not necessarily incentivized to install one of these multi-million-dollar solutions into the plans of the building?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So, talk about the data issue for building owners and operators. How big of an issue it is, and how do you think they should be addressing it?
Yeah, I think there's 2 issues. I'd be really interested in Zach's opinion on this because he brings a really interesting, more property management side to this discussion. But I think there is a go-to-market, almost a like access control issue from the OEMs, and then there's the price issue. Maybe we'll start with the first one and slightly more controversial one, but I think it's very important to talk about, which is the nature of the model that, the Johnson Controls and Schneider Electric sell their products means that they inherently are pushing out 95% of the built environment in the US and probably the world, right? So think of your like Honeywell sales, right? They often have controls providers that have regional exclusivity. So if you want a Honeywell system, you have like one or two providers to go to. Their systems are designed in extremely complicated ways because, you're like building space age technology because they're built for these buildings that can afford spending $15,000 to $25,000 an asset to instrument them. And these controls providers, because there's only one or two for each region, they have no incentive to like compress their margins or to do like lower dollar work, because why focus on instrumenting like a strip mall for pennies when you can instrument a skyscraper for millions of dollars? And then the last thing is their model, once they sell the hardware, rolling in typically 100-hour a year plus of like engineering work to service that system, means that they're incentivized to keep the systems complicated, right? Because if you designed a simple solution that didn't require 100 hours of engineering work a year to keep operational, and by the way, like no control system should, it's not like these skyscrapers are changing significantly. Like Salesforce instance that, isn't changing significantly for a company, or any of these other like SaaS technologies do not require you to sign like 100 hours a year of like an engineering service contract to keep up and running for your company. Yeah, right. I could rant about this for a while, but the crux of the issue is that like they are not incentivized to make the technology both easier to install and service and more affordable. And I think that dovetails nicely in the other issue is the technology itself, by trying to be able to work for everything, makes it extremely complicated and expensive. If you look at the typical, let's just focus on HVAC, the typical assets you see on rooftops, it's something like 60, 70% package units, like rooftop package units in the US. So if you focused on just building hardware for rooftop package units and maybe VAVs and split units, right? What's on the majority of buildings, you could design controls technology that's way more affordable, way more easier to understand and install, and easier to service than the current control solutions that are out there that try to be like a one size fits all for everything.
I mean, it sounds like something that happens in other industries, but sort of a regional monopolistic behavior and built-in incentives that also don't move the needle enough for them to innovate. And why would they? Because there's not much competition in a given region. But let's move to FTL. For people unfamiliar with FTL, what is it and who are you building this for?
Yeah, so Field Technologies is essentially a company that wants to make technicians and facility managers more efficient. That's our goal. We've been talking about hardware and software and controls, but we started the conversation with this game of telephone that Edward, you so accurately described. And I think that's the point of frustration and the point of, I would say, contention, like between the service provider and the facility manager and the end customer, that hopefully technology can solve or at least make better. But we're not a technology company in and of itself. We view ourselves as like a efficiency and productivity company that's targeted at what I would say like the underserved individuals in the American workforce are. If you think about like the white collar worker, there are millions of SaaS companies that have products to like eke out like 1 additional % of productivity from like your white collar worker in the American workforce. In San Francisco, where I live and work, I can look out the window right here and see like billboards for 5 or 6 different SaaS companies. So there's a huge amount of focus on increasing the efficiency and productivity of like the white collar American worker. But the skilled tradesman and the facility manager and all of these people that spend their entire lives doing what I think is the most important work in this country of like keeping our infrastructure up and running are neglected by the last 20 years of software and hardware development. So our goal in a nutshell is to provide solutions for these very important aspects of the American workforce to increase their efficiency in a way that I think most people haven't done before, and also in a way that respects their expertise instead of tries to replace them. For the small amount of companies that are focused on this problem, I think there's two types of approaches. There's companies that make the, in my opinion, the very arrogant approach of saying, like, I'm going to turn the American skilled tradesman into a unskilled laborer by automating away all the aspects of their job that require significant training. But what we want to do is realize that the skilled tradesman will always be the expert in the space. And we just want to build things that make them able to do more work and fix more problems instead of trying to replace them.
I think that's a noble mission. And I think to Zach's point earlier, the angriest calls usually are because HVAC isn't working. So imagining the facility managers, the technicians that are having to deal with these issues are dealing with high pressure scenarios where any help from the efficiency perspective would go a long way. And to go off on our first tangent here, I mean, and don't want to spoil Zach's collaboration superpower, which I would be very disappointed in if it's not Lee Kuan Yew, because Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of modern Singapore, his quote on air conditioning, I mean, he called air conditioning most important invention for us, perhaps one of the signal inventions of history. It changed the nature of civilization by making development possible in the tropics. And if you don't believe this, go and check out the German doctors wearing ice packs this summer. And
Yeah,
that may be a different issue. That may be related to energy, and the grid. But anyway, that's only confirming that technicians and facility managers really, when they're dealing with HVAC issues, it's shit hitting the fan in French. Now, talk about pricing, because I mean, the traditional building automation systems, they can run, $5,000 to $10,000 or more per asset. And, for skyscrapers, it's in the millions of dollars. So we landed on a price point that is a factor of 10x smaller than that per unit, $500 to $700 per unit. So how did you get there? And why does this number matter for adoption?
to go back to what I was talking about earlier, our goal really is we want to instrument buildings, not because we want to sell hardware, we want to be a controls company. It's because we believe that data will be like foundational to making the skilled tradesman more efficient, right? Like knowing what a problem is before you roll a truck is kind of the holy grail of predictive maintenance, right? And something, to Zach's point, like people have been chasing for a long time. And our opinion is at FTL that you can't do that without real-time data. So to solve that problem, we would prefer, honestly, to just buy controls equipment from somebody that's been doing it for a while, but nobody's at the price point where it can be appealing for 90% of the built environment in the US. So we had to go out and build our own hardware so that we could affordably instrument things at a price that makes sense. We like to think that if we can justify the cost of our hardware, including installation, within like 2 tangible events, then it should be appealing to the market at large. And what I mean by that is if I can go to somebody and say, hey, installing FTL hardware on your rooftop package units at your building will justify the cost in 2 prevented truck rolls, not a year, not every quarter, over the life of the installed equipment, right? If our hardware is able to accurately predict an issue and solve a problem and prevent a truck roll twice ever, it's paid for itself. But to be able to take that approach, you have to be at such a low price point that you don't need to do any of this like gamesmanship, to be frank, that we see in the current control space where people are like, well, this will save you 2% energy. And, it has a payback period of 5 years based on energy savings. And that's why, like, yes, our hardware does save energy, but we try to not make the focus on that. We don't need that to justify the cost. Energy savings are like a happy accident of installing FTL hardware. So our goal is like 10% of the cost of a traditional control system, but 90% of the efficiency. And the question I always get when I say that is like, okay, how do you do it for that price? And the example I always give is Blink, the Amazon little cameras that you can put around your house. Pre that, if you wanted to install like a home security system in your house, you'd have to run Cat5 all over the place. You'd have to install a server in your basement, running some proprietary software that you have to pay for, get a technician to come out and install it and program all of it. And that system definitely would be like more capable than a Blink system, but like 90% of users don't need all the capabilities of that system. So Blink at a fraction of the cost allows you to get 90% of the way there. And that's kind of what we say about FTL controls. It has 90% of the capability of traditional controls at 10% of the cost.
That 10% certainly is attractive for the venture community where they're looking for that 10x usually difference, right? You're calling this category facilities triage. What's the reasoning behind that definition, and why not, instead of calling it building controls or remote monitoring?
We like to think that our goal is to allow technicians and facility managers to like maximize their own efficiencies and do what they love to do, right? Like a technician did not become a technician to be a truck driver, and a facility manager did not become a facility manager to do secretarial work and like copy work orders between two systems. So facilities triage takes the same triage mindset from a hospital and applies it to this like facilities management flow that we talked about earlier. So in a hospital, you have patients showing up and you triage them based on the severity of their issues. And that allows the hospital to maximize its throughput, right? Like maximize its efficiency and make sure that it saves the most lives. So we take the same approach to facilities management work in that the service provider is a finite resource and is more in demand on like hot days for HVAC work, for example. So how can we, across like an entire portfolio, triage the work for a facility manager that is surfacing on a hot day and make sure that they can achieve, which is what's really their only goal, maximize the uptime of the buildings in their portfolio at an affordable price while also dealing with essentially finite resources. Again, this goes back to the point of controls data not being an end in itself, right? Like we instrument buildings to make that possible, because without live instrumentation or live data from running assets, you can't do that kind of like real-time labor optimization that is necessary to make a triage environment possible.
Zach, curious your thoughts on, Clayton mentioned a few asset classes that are ripe for adopting FTL here: retail, healthcare, shopping centers. But in terms of the right moment when there's interest from the operator, from the building owner, if you've owned or operated a building long enough, this has happened to you. Doesn't happen as often, and you certainly are not expecting or wishing it happens to you. But when it does, it's all hands on deck. But when it happens, you have to deal with the issue. When the HVAC goes down, that's not when you're gonna think, oh yeah, let's call FTL. Like you first need to fix the issue, and then, or that's at least the mindset that I saw when I was working at Proprietary earlier, trying to help people monitor their water leaks. So what type of asset classes do you see were ripe for adopting FTL-like solutions? And also, when is the right time to adopt FTL if it's not yesterday before the issue happens?
Yeah, I think it's retail. I think it's shopping centers. I think it's high street retail where landlords have density with triple net leases. Those are assets that are pretty much guaranteed to not have complex building management systems already installed. But the push in that case, it's got to come from the tenants themselves, right? So you have to have the retailers sort of screaming for it, and you have to try to get the retailers to put this stuff into the leases, right? We've seen huge disruption in the retail sector, specifically around COVID. Lots of old tenants going bankrupt, maybe shrinking their spaces, lots of new tenants coming in. I think the landlord in those cases doesn't really move unless the triple net tenants, the retailers, force their hand. So I think in this particular case, and it's complicated, you have to do a kind of dual sale. You have to sell both to the landlord property manager, and then you also have to sell to the retail tenant. It's not necessarily the retail tenant who's paying up front, but if the retail tenant demands it and says, oh, I won't sign a lease unless you have preventative maintenance for the HVAC in the core of the base building, the landlord's not going to move. Because anyone who's been a landlord for triple net leases knows that they're wonderful because the tenant is really in charge of their own interior space. And part of the motivation for a real estate investor to buy a triple net lease property is because it's relatively hands-off.
Clayton, you're testing last time we spoke, you were testing at around 60 sites with a product launch coming soon. So what have you learned from those deployments that change how you think about the product?
Yeah, well, I think Zach is exactly right. What we realized is that to go and get the property owners on board, we had to first demonstrate it with the people leasing the properties. So that's what we've been testing with, mostly multi-site FM. So think any of your main retailers that have thousands of stores all over the US. And because our technology is very portable, we use external instrumentation and it's wireless. It's very easy for these retailers to move the technology with them from triple net lease to triple net lease. So we're kind of, again, in Stack, I'd be really interested in what you think of this approach. We're starting with the multi-site FM and the retailers and getting them to put it in their triple net leases once they take over, because they're responsible for the assets. So they're incentivized to want to minimize cost of maintenance for those assets. And then hopefully as we get more well-known and our technology's more proven, we can kind of move up a level to the landlords or the building owners or the property owners themselves.
Yeah, I think that's the right way to do it.
So the bigger opportunity here, connecting the 6 million commercial buildings in the US, you've said it, according to estimates, only about 7 to 16% of commercial buildings are connected right now. So what unlocks the rest?
Yeah, I mean, it's got to be affordable. Our control systems are wireless, but not because we like wireless controls in and of themselves, right? It's because they need to be wireless so that you don't have to run Cat5 all over a building. It's a part of the affordability pitch. I really think that is the reason. I think if you were to have instrumentation for free, everybody would buy it. There's some kind of adoption curve based on price. And currently at the price of controls, you end up with 13%-ish of buildings that can afford it. And our goal is to push it as far to the left as possible. We're not going to give it away for free, obviously. But if we can make it affordable enough, the theory is that most people want it. We're going to market next month, so we will verify that. And maybe I'll follow up with you, Edward, and let you know. But our goal is to basically offer a solution that's for the, I'd say, 75 to 80, 87% of buildings that have just been completely underserved and unable to bake the cost of control systems into their operating models.
Depends when you're listening to this, know that we're recording on July 10th, so the product may be already out. Let's fast forward to the future. What does facility management look like in 3 to 5 years if this category takes off?
Yeah, I think in general, what I envision is that we can focus both the facility manager and the skilled tradesman back to the things that made them choose those career paths in the first place. They did not become facility managers to copy work orders between 3 CMMSs and manage 5 email inboxes and play games of telephone tag all day, right? They became facility managers because they enjoy solving problems. They enjoy managing a real estate portfolio. They enjoy working with skilled tradesmen across a lot of different verticals. So if we can, and sadly, because to an earlier point, technology innovations have largely been unfocused on this group of the American workforce, they're still doing all this secretarial work themselves. When in other areas, this is all automated or being automated by things like AI. If we can focus them back on solving interesting problems and make that maybe 75% of their day instead of the 25% that it is now. I forget the actual study, but there's some paper we can find and link to this that actually stacks their time by day. And it's very little of their time is actually spent fixing facility management problems. So if we can focus them back in on that, I think we can allow them to be more efficient and improve their job satisfaction, right? They're back to doing what originally made them want to go into facility management in the first place.
Switch gears a little bit here. You've hinted at how your connectivity network is easier, cheaper, faster without saying it, or more reliable. So for those with a more technical background out there, and I do think when I was at ProCentry, talking here about LoRaWAN, long range wide area network, which is not Wi-Fi. It's essentially Wi-Fi for long distance. it was always a conundrum between how much in depth should you go into it, because people know Wi-Fi took years, but everyone knows Wi-Fi now is a verb, but people don't know LoRaWAN, even though it has been around for many years. Only now it's becoming a little more commercialized and more widely adopted. How much of a benefit is the fact that you use LoRaWAN over Wi-Fi, and how do you think about going into the details of this network when you're talking to potential customers?
Luckily, LoRaWAN is starting to become more well-known, I'd say, in the last 2 years. Funnily enough, I think the war in Ukraine was kind of a big booster for it. I'm not sure if you're aware, but when Russia first invaded, they established a texting network throughout the entire country using LoRaWAN. So it's an extremely capable long-range technology. Data rate is super low, talking dial-up speeds are slower. But if all you're sending is telemetry data, numbers every few minutes, it's perfectly capable for that. Or a short text message in the case, the example we were just discussing. So I think people are able to understand it with more context now. And also, with the rapid pace of technological innovation in the last few years, people are more accepting of new things. We have to prove that it works, obviously. But for us, it was really important that we stuck to an open standard. There's a competitor out there, I won't say their name out loud, but their name is a temperature and it's 5 degrees warmer than the 70 degrees Fahrenheit that I like to keep my office, that has a proprietary protocol. And I understand why they went that route. It means that they get to lock down a building and use it for their own purposes. But like I mentioned earlier, FTL is not a hardware company. We make hardware because we have to, not because we need to. And we want other people to come into the space and make hardware. And we want that hardware to easily function on our systems. The important thing to us is gathering telemetry data from buildings, not being the one to instrument the buildings ourselves. Plus, if you're designing technology for 75% of the American market, I think it's insane to think that you're going to do that entirely yourself. That's a lot of buildings to instrument. So picking an open standard was really important for us. Picking one that had the range to handle, or the robustness to handle, going through multi-levels of concrete buildings, going in and out of metal walk-in freezers, which are essentially a big Faraday cage. Being able to handle all that was really important. And LoRaWAN is really the only option for doing that in an open protocol.
Zach, how do you think about it from a venture seed perspective? Because oftentimes investors would prioritize proprietary. They might think that it gives them a moat, gives them defensibility, gives them value, enterprise value. But there's the other side of the coin, which is clients may perceive that you want to lock them in and that they'll be locked forever in the wrong system that doesn't work in 5 years for them. So how do you think about proprietary versus non-proprietary and open systems from a venture backing perspective?
This is kind of a lame answer, but I would like to hedge my bets. I'd like to have exposure to both. I don't think I'm smart enough to know which protocol people in the industry are going to gravitate toward. So I would look at it, I would say, okay, if someone's developed their own protocol, that means they have a technical moat that's creating value. There's IP there that's theoretically valuable at exit. And then I would also look at a company built on an open protocol, and I would say, well, that company is going to be able to scale much faster because of the lower barrier to entry. So I am not smart enough to know which one is going to win. So from a venture perspective, I'd like to back both.
I think there's been more appetite for this in the last 5 years, to my knowledge, in the venture community than previously, because outside of the space, but more in the software space, there's been some really good examples of companies building a very profitable layer on top of an open framework. The first one that comes to mind is Vercel. I don't know if you're familiar with them, the software company, right? So they have their Next.js JavaScript framework that's an open source framework that anybody can use. But because they built the framework, right, they understand it better than everybody else. And using their tools that work seamlessly with this open framework is kind of a no-brainer. So it was kind of hey, we want as many software engineers to adopt Next.js as possible, and then we're going to build the best tools for it and kind of own the market that way. I think a lot of people were you have to either build a defensive moat or become like the best player in an ecosystem. And now like a lot of companies are showing that you can do both, which is really interesting.
Yeah, I think we're actually customers of Vercel, and we love the product. We moved all our Metaprop hosting over to them. I think if you look at analogy here, we can look at the foundation models, right? And there's been tremendous value creation associated with proprietary models, whether it's Anthropic's Mythos model or the new models coming out of OpenAI. And then there's also been tremendous value creation in the open source. I just saw the other day Hugging Face, which is a super interesting open source LLM platform, has just hit $100 million in revenue. So there's clearly demand for both. And I think we're going to see demand for both in this sector as well.
Well, what's wild of these foundation models, what would be wild outcome is if somehow the Chinese models end up being the leading open source ones, while the American company models end up being a closed ones. But I think we're still in the early innings of that. Last but not least, collaboration superpower. If you could choose one person, historic or living, real or fictional, to do a partnership with, who would it be?
Oh man, this is a hard one. I don't know about you, but whenever I get depressed, I kind of like go back and read the German philosophers because you'll never be as depressed as they were. So I think a really interesting like parallel to today's time is Immanuel Kant. I don't know if you've read very much Kant yourself, but he comes from this very interesting time at like the end of the Enlightenment, where there was this big crisis of Enlightenment thought where Newton had kind of made the world so hyper-focused on this new physics that people thought that they could understand everything and then they could rationalize everything. And if you take that to like its philosophical extreme, it becomes like, if I can rationalize everything and I haven't figured out like what a soul is or what free will is or any of these other things, like, do we even have those? And like, what makes us human? And if you take that to even a further extreme, how do we really know that free rational thought can even exist, right? If we can break everything down to like mechanistic or casual laws, then, you know, maybe that becomes a path for authoritarianism. And it kind of predicted that way before, you know, the authoritarianism of the 1940s came up. But he provided a solution to this. He provided like a reconciliation between like what makes us human while still allowing us to think rationally, really champion the powers of human reason against this like really rising trend of rationality amid a like very rapidly changing technological time. So that might sound very familiar to today. So today, I think we need like a Kant in our world to say like, hey, yeah, there's this AI thing, but being a human and thinking like a human is really important and something that should be valued.
One of the best answers we've ever gotten. Do you think effective altruism comes from Kant a little bit or a bit more before Kant?
I mean, if you really want my unvarnished opinion on effective altruism, I think it comes from people that have been coddled in educational systems their entire life and have never experienced the real world.
Yep. Zach, collaboration superpower.
Done in the past, I've done the legendary Willis Carrier, but today I'm going to go even deeper into history, and I'm going to go with the Chinese engineer Ding Huan, who lived during the Han Dynasty. This gentleman was alive around 100 BC, and he invented the first ever giant rotary fan. So this is the first cooling device humanity's ever seen. It was about 10 feet in diameter, and it had to be sort of powered by humans and pulleys and all this stuff. But that's the first example in human history of a human-created cooling device. So I'd love to see what Ding Huan could come up with today, given the advancements in technology since 100 BC.
Wow. Can you imagine how hard it must have been in 80 in the common era for this fella Ding to have created this? That's amazing.
Very cool.
So to recap, today we covered what's actually broken in how commercial buildings get maintained and why the answer is in more expensive system. It's a cheaper and smarter one. We talked about the game of telephone that plays out every time an HVAC unit goes down, what changes when a facility manager has real-time data instead of a phone call, and why labor shortage is pushing both building owners and service providers towards the same solution at the same time. And we talked about what it actually means to connect the roughly 5 to 6 million commercial buildings in the US that still have no visibility into their own equipment. Clayton, where can technicians, property managers, field managers, and property owners learn more about FTL and connect with you?
Yeah, so our website is ftl.build. You can get my email from the website. Feel free to shoot me an email. Feel free to call us.
Clayton, thanks for coming on Tangent, a Commercial Observer podcast.
Thanks very much for having me.
Muchas gracias. If you learned something new or enjoyed the conversation, text a friend the link to this episode right now. You can find links, resources, and ways to connect with us in the show notes.